I'm Frits Pannekoek. I'm a professor at Athabasca University today in Heritage Studies and Canadian Studies. In the past, I was at one point head of research for Parks Canada Prairie region for its historic buildings out of Winnipeg. And then I moved to Alberta and became director of historic sites, ultimately historic sites and archives for the province for about 25 years. And during that period, managed to work with a bunch of professionals to get the heritage program off the ground and make it as robust as possible. After that, I went to the University of Calgary, became involved in the digital world because that always interested me and how you preserve information and how you preserve it for the nation, and then off to Athabasca to be its president, and then after that to be a professor in heritage and Canadian studies. I've also been involved in the not-for-profit sector. I was a member of the Athabasca Historical Society and still am, the Preservation Society. And I was, from time to time, president of the Calgary Civic Trust as well, which is sponsoring this, this initiative to record trades. Because trades, I find, are really, really critical. And there's a, just like Dave, I believe there's an incredible scarcity of these, and we have to worry about the next generation of skilled tradespeople. And that's not only in the skills for buildings, but also in crafts, in making items and objects. And Alberta is different from the other provinces. Mostly, we're similar to Saskatchewan in that our frontier was not a frontier of crafting or making. It was a frontier of importing. So most people went to the store to buy stuff. Most people did build their own homes, but they were often by skilled craftsmen. When we think of log buildings as the norm in early settlement period, they weren't. It was, you know, a carpenter or the carpenter built or built by people who knew basic carpentry skills. And then we also have the phenomena of the imported house. That is, go to the catalog, choose your house, put it on a train, and it arrives, and you put it up. And we have a number of catalog homes within Western Canada. And they're also the whole brick built phenomenon. Alberta, south it's more sandstone, the north it's more red brick. But the whole process of making brick, of ensuring that the brick had some life, though when you were building frontier, you care about tomorrow, not 100 years from then. So what we're really short of in Alberta as well is people who are really, really knowledgeable about brick and brick making, or the construction of frame buildings, including balloon frame versus other kinds of framing of buildings. And if you do not understand how these buildings were built, you can get yourself and the heritage building you're responsible for, you can cause a lot of unintended trouble. So you don't want to do that. Anyway, that's some of my background, and I'm now very, very involved with Indigenous communities as well.
What are you doing what's your work with the Indigenous communities?
Well, I'm on the board of the Macaisto Foundation, working with them, raising money to rebuild their college. But I was first fascinated when I became involved with Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump and learned how Indigenous ways of thinking and planning can change the way non-Indigenous people actually approach tasks. They tend to be more community oriented. They tend to value elders more. They intend during meetings, they tend to listen more carefully. And when you're in Indigenous spaces, if you're aware of how ideas flow and how power is organized, then all of a sudden you have different insights into the way that culture works and the way that culture can contribute to current solution of current problems. anyway, so I've just got a book out on that, on the impact of Indigenous ways of knowing on non-Indigenous architectural practice. So that we'll see what happens to that. Anyway, maybe nothing.
That's great. And do you want to talk more about what kind of trades are disappearing in your eyes? And you were talking about the framing and the bricks and brick.
The biggest problems I think is if you know how to plan, if you know your legal environment and your regulatory environment, but most important, if you know how to plan and research, then you can start to what I call unravel the complexities of a building. For example, and you have to have an interest in that building. For example, just starting, what kind of wood was used? Why was that wood used? What are the problems with a certain kind of woods? What is the shrinkage rate of certain woods in a prairie environment, particularly woods that might have been imported from British Columbia? You have to understand wood really well. And most people, well, you buy a 2x4, it's either crooked or straight and you slap it up. Well, it's not quite like that, but you do really have to understand your woods and your construction materials. Then what you have to do is you really have to understand the mind of the people who put the early buildings together. There is a book by Don Wetherell called Homes in Alberta, and it talks about the construction techniques and the design of homes. So you have to know your woods, but you also have to know how and why the mechanics of buildings change. So when you introduced wiring, for example, into houses, when was wiring introduced? And then what impact did it have on the structures of the building? Because all of a sudden you're drilling holes and doing things, weakening timbers, etc. But a lot of people don't think about things like space and the introduction of new technology like electricity, because Alberta was on the cusp of that. And that changed the house. It also changed the organization of space within the house. So most people don't worry about that. Now, once you worry about that and resolve it in your head about how the place was put together, what it's structured, what the kind of mechanicals were introduced in the house, or how new mechanicals influence the house, i.e. Hot water heating versus hot air furnaces, and the changes happened quite quickly. If you understand those, then you can understand why certain finishes were chosen, why certain plasters were chosen for the interior, what the impact of heat might have been on rapid heating in a winter, on shrinkage of plasters. And all these things just go on and on. But what I think mostly of, and the example I use is, the last thing people worry about is paint, other than, my God, does it have lead? But do they think about, how does paint adhere to certain woods? What does the finish look like? When the finish deteriorates over time, can you have a planned change over time of that finish? That is, so when paint peels, it peels in the right way. Because if you take some of the modern paints, they age differently. Colors change differently. And the example I always use is Stephenson House. Stephenson House near Red Deer, the home of Iceland's poet laureate. When the home was acquired by the province, it was an excruciating pink with green trim. And everyone's thought that that Stephenson had it wrong, that the restoration people had it wrong. But what we found when we acquired the house, it was brown and beige. Then what we did is we found the tin cans in the basement of the old house, and it was pink and green. So how do you reconcile those two colors? What it was sunlight changed pink and green to beige and brown. So over a 20-year period, you had the colors of a house change. Then as a restoration expert, and after much debate with the family, what color do you paint the house? Do you go back to the original pink and green, pink and green, which nobody remembers, or do you go to the sun-bleached brown and beige, which everyone remembers over the last 20 years? So, I mean, those are some of the planning considerations, but it's also a consideration of the chemical composition of paint, how it changes over time, and when are you going to intercede in those colors, and when are you going to bring it back? So those are some of the incredible debates, and some of the people who specialize in paint will say, you planners figure out what color you want, and we will go along with it. Some people who specialize in paints will say, if it was originally a green and pink, then you should so construct your maintenance schedule that it'll always be green and pink, or do you allow it to have a 20-year life cycle? So I'm quite interested in all those impossibilities. And that's the same with brick. Like the Alberta brick tend to and can be easily, because they're somewhat fragile, is if moisture gets into the brick, the face can pop off, as you know. So if you use inappropriate treatments of brick, you can destroy a building. For example, if you silicone the exterior of a building, moisture gets captured behind, all of a sudden you can have, not saying it will happen, but you can have the face of a brick fly off as someone's walking by. But even more important, you can destroy the entire structure of a particular building. So how do you deal with that? And that's where you need people who really understand the chemistry of brick, how you make those brick, what happens to it over time, how you stabilize that brick. And do we have people who know that? A few people, but not a lot. And most of them are quite aged. I knew a gentleman who specialized in Alberta brick and had a collection of brick from every factory in this entire province and every home brick maker. And that knowledge, yes, he published a book, but it is, again, a lost set of knowledge, it really is. And the same with some people who know, who don't seem that old. There's someone who specialized in sandstone and the composition of Alberta sandstone. And what happens to that sandstone over time? What happens with acid rain on sandstone? So all of this stuff, I worry a lot about the fact that we use modern technologies to preserve the past, but we really don't know what the long-term impact of some of these technologies might be. For example, brick and then putting a silicone or some kind of sealants on brick. When that was first done, everyone thought, ingenious, wonderful, it'll help preserve the building forever, but it didn't do that. So we have to make certain that we understand, you know, our paints, our woods, our bricks, our sandstone, the form of building construction, the technologies that were introduced into structures over time, and how those impacted the preservation of building as well. So as I say to people, it's a very, very complex process, and we have to figure out how we preserve what little heritage we have through very, very careful knowledge, basically knowledge of heritage trade practitioners. And those are increasingly hard to come by because nobody teaches it. It's all done through mentorship and commitment and interest. Yeah, there's one or two schools and colleges across Canada that'll help you, but there's so few people learning. I found in the heritage practice that if you try to find someone who is knowledgeable about the various elements in your house, you will likely have difficulty finding someone. You'll have people who say they do, but then you start asking questions about paints, woods, changes of wiring over time, the framing of buildings, like, when did balloon frame buildings start in Alberta? When did they end? What are the consequences for heritage preservation? How would you ensure that a building that is balloon frame is stabilized or stable? So there's lots of things to fuss and worry about. And increasingly, the people who have that knowledge tend to work for bureaucracies. There's few that work as private citizens and private businessmen, but the majority are regulators within ministries or municipal governments, or perhaps foundations, and that will cause problems in the long run. So I believe you need a robust private sector with this knowledge, as well as a robust regulatory sector.
Yeah, and how would you, in what ways do you think are the best to pass on this knowledge, through university courses and colleges, or in other ways? What would, in your opinion, be the best way to do it?
I think the best way to produce one would be to ensure that our Blue Seal, Red Seal programs have a heritage stream in them, so that it becomes a part of trades education and learning. And it's a choice that tradesmen can make, because right now there are some, like, I don't know my Blue Seal and Red Seal well enough, but I do think if you have a strong heritage stream in let's say the Red Seal, and have it in the various components, that you might begin to spark an interest, or at least the questioning of tradespeople saying, yes, I remember that unit. I better go look at it to determine what the issues and problems are. And I'm thinking not only of people who might be taking carpentry or cabinet making or painting. I'm thinking of even boiler makers. For example, you have a heritage boiler. The first thing that we do currently, because of building code, is you whip out that old boiler and you put in a new one. Then you change pressure systems and your hot water doesn't work the same way. And so nobody really understands fully the interactions between old technologies and new technologies. I mean, some people do understand, but generally the solution is rip it out, replace it. That's the solution. And in a green environment, that should not be the solution. The solution should be, reuse, recycle, rehab, understanding the fabrics and how to manage them effectively so that they don't end up in the landfills.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's I think a fantastic answer in the sense that it's all comes together, and that confluence is important. Interested in just kind of in your history, what was your upbringing in this work, and how did you get it started in this?
It was an interest, because one starts by getting a doctorate in Canadian and Western Canadian history. But I'll have to be frank, is that when I started, I didn't have that great an interest in what I call place, but that happened fairly quickly. And it started really with that first job with Parks Canada, and doing the historic research for all of the buildings in Western Canada, and developing what I call a preservation ethic. That is, you do minimal replacement, you preserve as much of the original fabric, you identify where you've made replacements, you do outstanding plans, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's the ethic within parks, which I consider a very good one. But most important, in that period, I got to know a lot of people in the communities. And what became really critical is the associative and emotional values that buildings have to communities. And that's something that we often lose. You bring a specialist in from Ottawa or Winnipeg or wherever, and telling people, you must do this and you must do that. But they don't talk about, and I'm not saying they're really there, but they don't talk about the ghosts of the building, which is the emotion you feel as you enter a structure, simply because you know it's been there for 300 years. For example, you go to York Factory and you see the old factory buildings, and you start poking around and you see images under the shelves that were done in 1730, 1740, caricatures of the chief actor. Obviously the guys hated him, something fierce. They were rather mean caricatures. But you start poking around buildings like that, then they reveal themselves in the past to you, and no written record can actually do the same thing, have that same emotional connection. So I think when you do restoration, you have to be respectful of the emotional connection that the community and Canadians as a whole have with that particular structure. And for example, Riel's house in Winnipeg, which we found after research was Riel's mother's house, but still that house had an incredible attachment to by the Métis community, because Riel lay in state there. He was so large and so tall that his coffin couldn't lay flat in the living room. The coffin was upright in the house. But it's that house has an incredible meaning to a lot of people. So you toy with it with great care and great understanding and with community involvement. And that doesn't mean you tell them as a professional, this is what you must do. It's rather, what should we do collectively to ensure that the atmosphere of the house is actually preserved. And that's probably the hardest thing to do, because preservationists tend to, when you do the planning process, you say, okay, we're going to restore this house to 1886 or 1885, let's say Riel's mother's house, because that's when he came to lay in state. But is that the right period to do it to? What about a later period in which you have more knowledge and you destroy less of the emotional fabric? So that all of that really does matter, and you have to talk to both the community, to the tradespeople, to say whether you can or cannot maintain a building. There's a whole raft of things you have to do. And often the trade side doesn't talk to the community doesn't talk to the trade side. You have a disconnect, and then you have upset people.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to when you talk about unraveling the complexity of the building, and then having the spirituality of the building maintained in these works. And you're talking about the hardest thing to do is maintain the atmosphere. Do you want to elaborate more on maintaining the atmosphere and of these historic sites, and kind of finding that spot that encapsulates it all?
Well, yeah, the spot is the spot. Let's say the sweet spot in which everyone's happy is somewhere in the middle always. But it requires conversation. Professionals can't persuade community to do things that might actually destroy the spirit of the house. And I've seen that happen. You might say, well, you're restoring it. Wouldn't it be great to restore this house? Let's say you get it in the 1960s and you restore it to a much earlier period. Well, that means removing this addition, removing this, changing the color. Well, once you do that, then the house is no longer the house that meant so much to the community. The question I always ask of this, it's the community and tradespeople figure out what the spot is. But the example I always use is the Director General of National Historic Sites said, okay, you got this artifact. artifact. House is an artifact, or a building could be an artifact, just a more complex artifact. You have this axe, and it's grandfather's axe, and grandfather, was a really important person, and he built a house with it, and this artifact means a lot to people. The handle wears out, so then you replace the handle, and it's an exact replica, done by a really good tradesman. Now, is that still grandfather's axe? And some people say, well, yeah, the blade's still there. Okay, you use it in demonstrations. 20 or 30 years later, you decide to remove the head because it's sort of worn out and gone, and you're going to replace the head. But it's going to be exactly the same as the original head. Now, is this grandfather's axe? I mean, to people in the community, the process of change of the axe, it will still be grandfather's axe. But to me, it's somebody will ask you, because this is the number one question you get when you visit any historic building and it looks really great. It's, is this real? It doesn't have the patina of the past. So how do you preserve that? Well, that's one of the great challenges. There are cultures in which the process of replacement is in fact the preservation of the spirit. You go to Japan and you go to the Golden Temple, for example. The Golden Temple, I think, was last replaced, I could be wrong, somewhere in 1950. The process and the trades involved are what matter. So it's, if you've got the right rituals and you've got the right process, then there is a continuum. So that's what matters, that the trades are the key to the whole thing. Now, if you look at indigenous cultures in Canada, there's a real tension between an indigenous preservation ethic and a non-indigenous preservation ethic. You get folks like us, we trade with indigenous people, and you trade the old pipes, the old ceremonial bundles, you put them into museums, and you say, well, we preserved that culture because it was under threat, just like you might preserve a building. But the indigenous community says you're supposed to return those bundles to nature. You haven't returned them to nature. You've kept them in your house of the dead, or whatever one wants to call a museum. And we've lost because you keep these alive, the bundles, you think they're alive in the museum, but they're really dead. But the ability of the people to remake those bundles may have been lost. So you've kept the bundles, but you destroyed the people. So to me, it's just like in trades, we may be destroying the trades, and they really are key to the understanding and preservation of the building. But if they don't know the rituals, they don't have the knowledge and the way of doing it, we will end up, as many indigenous cultures, having lost the way forward. So I look at trades, they are the way forward, but they have to have that education on all the elements, whether it's a thatching of roofs, wood, or whether it's certain blacksmithing technologies, or whether it's making parfleche containers, or whether it's how did early electrical systems work? What were all these, these insulators? What did they look like? Why did they change over time? And yet, at the moment, I would say there are a few people that know. The knowledge is scattered. It is not necessarily collected, and there are people with that knowledge. For example, there's a major glass insulator collector in Salt Spring Island with one of the greatest collections of glass insulators you've ever seen, who knows the purpose of every one. Now, this is absolutely fascinating because the technology of electricity changed so rapidly, and we don't know too much about how we put our electrical systems, early ones, together. And that's true with vehicles as well. As to getting an antique vehicle running, there's about 4 people that have an assemblage of knowledge over time. And they're they're scarce as hen's teeth, but they do mentor people. But again, if you're going to be an automobile technician, a tradesman, there should be a trade certificate that also has a good heritage component. And hopefully in the next decade or so, that's something that we can move towards.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's a great answer about the preservation of the knowledge and passing that down. I'm just curious, where did your knowledge come from, and who are your mentors in your work?
I would say that the mentors in the work, it's all self-taught. When I arrived in Winnipeg, there was one historian and a lot of craftspeople at Lower Fort Garry, but there was never much interaction. It came later at, well, there were tradespeople at Lower Fort Garry and with parks, but they were totally separated from those people who were doing the planning. It's the planners would say, this is the period of the house, this is, whatever. And then the tradespeople would say, well, this is what you're going to have to do to bring it to period. Okay. But nobody at that point thought that bringing it to period was the wrong thing. This was a journey of interest and discovery. And as long as you have an open mind, which I hope I do, to information, you will always be learning. And I'd say that was the process that I enjoyed most, is because I didn't have people telling me what to do for the most part. I could invent my own process, and I was very lucky to have very tolerant supervisors who always let me do what I wanted. And I was also very fortunate that I never actually, this is something that I wouldn't quote, but I never had to actually do anything. I was always a manager, so I could always think and shape and offer direction, but I never really had to had anyone telling me what to do. So there was maybe a gentleman in Parks Canada in Ottawa, Max Sutherland, who was extraordinarily tolerant and you could have long chats with. And a guy, he was probably the most influential of the lot. But again, I could probably no more than 10 hours of conversation. It's also being in a responsible position gave you a lot of time to critique documents, think things through, do a lot of reading. But preservation in Canada in the 1970s was really very, very, very immature. The Alberta Historical Resources Act was only passed in the mid to late 70s. When they passed the act, they had no professionals, maybe one or two at the most within the ministry. It was gathering examples that I would say the 70s were unusual in that all of a sudden people thought as a subset of Confederation celebrations that Canada ought to do more with its preservation. So as a result of the post-Confederation discussions, all of a sudden every province was interested in heritage. Each province did things entirely differently. Some provinces had historians, and I'll admit I'm a historian, as their director. Some of them had people who were interpreters. Others were people who were into, buildings for building's sake, architecture, let's say, because buildings have to look nice or you don't preserve them. And then other provinces had archaeologists managing their process. So if you look throughout Canada, the provinces that had archaeologists go in one direction. The provinces that are dominated by architects tend to go for building styles. Provinces that had people who were interested in history tend to look for the homes and places where important things happen. And in the end, of course, you need all of them. But each of Alberta's provinces has gone in a different way. Consequently, right now in Canada, we have probably the worst dog's breakfast of policies, procedures with no national direction at all. It's really quite interesting, and I can intellectualize it, but it's not healthy for the building stock of this country.
Where does Alberta fall on that spectrum of architects and having?
It tended to be, I would say, academic leadership. As a assistant deputy minister, tended to be archaeologists. Directors tended to be historians. The staff tended to be preservation specialists. So you tended to have in our legislation a stronger focus on archaeology, and you had a stronger regulatory framework for archaeology and paleontology than you did for buildings, because the argument was, well, when a building is destroyed, it's gone, it's destroyed. If you impact archaeology, well, you can study it first and you can at least extract information. I used to argue you can do the same with the building. You should do an impact assessment before any building is changed or altered. But no, that didn't go over well, largely because property values are considered sacred in this part of the world, and you don't tamper with property ownership, property rights, and legislation is so constructed to make sure that that never happens. It does sometimes, but generally it doesn't happen.
Like that. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts about the spirituality of these sites. And you're talking, even working at like Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, and these living histories preserving these sites. And if you have any thoughts about the spirituality of physical or land-based sites, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, it's if you go into the problem, I've come to the conclusion that the spirituality or the of a site depends on your knowledge of the site. It's if you have no knowledge and go into a structure, let's say the Batoche Church, you'll say, oh, yeah, pretty old church, yeah. The moment you know what happened in that church, even before, and you should know before you enter it, all of a sudden you see things and you focus on things that you wouldn't necessarily focus before. The same with a place which I'll use frequently is Stephenson House. If you know what went on at Stephenson House, you know how important the study was. This is where Stephenson wrote those poems overlooking the Rockies, over trees obscure your view. But you can almost see that man writing in that dark space. Now, if you didn't know he was a poet, and you thought, nice old farmhouse, a bit peculiar, then you might have a different sense. So you have to know. For example, at Head Smashed In, one of the elders said to me, it's about 5 to 6 years after the site was open, I now know that the spirit of the buffalo has returned to this building. He said, I know it's here. So you as I was pleased that there was a firm conviction that there was now a spirit in the building. I had the opportunity to stay overnight once in that building, and after obviously the elder told me what he felt, you then feel it too. Now why? I don't know, but you do. So the spirit and the building comes with knowledge and community. You can't separate anything out. For example, at Stephenson House, you know that one of his sons committed suicide there. And once you know the story and where it happened, all of a sudden the place changes again. Or the minister of Iceland came, and I didn't know the story. She said, if you drink from the pump at Stephenson House, you will begin to speak in Icelandic verse or in verse. I thought, oh, okay, you want to believe that? That's good. I can make a poet out of anyone that would just come sell the water. Well, believe it or not, some people do believe it. Now, maybe it's they already had the power of verse, and this just gave them the conviction and the connection with land. So you have to, I think if that building wasn't there, would that spirituality be allowed to exist at that house? No, the building is there with the stories and with the fabric, in which you can honestly answer the question, is this real? And if you say, yes, this is real, the stories are real, then all of a sudden you pull together. It's like the Japanese and the temples and the rebuilding of the temples. But if you go to the great cathedrals in Britain, for example, that have been around since 1400, and you know some of the stories, then you can feel a connection with the past. And we tend to often remove patina in buildings that is the connector between past and present. So one of the things we have to figure out is how you manage patina in buildings. And for example, we tend to, okay, paint's gone, it's destroyed, needs a new paint job, we'll find the right accurate paint, we'll put it back on, but that doesn't preserve the patina of the building or the patina of time. So I think one thing that most heritage building planners don't do is they don't worry as much as they should about the layers of age. But that's an easy thing for someone like me to say, but it's up to a person who really knows the fabric and how to manage that patina so you don't destroy it. Just like the restoration of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. Go to the East Block. They've done a wonderful job of restoration, but I would say the preservation of the layers of age is not as well done. I'm not saying it isn't done, it's just not as well done.
Yeah, it's what you make of it in those sites of great reverence, and I think that's a great way of looking at it, and that asking yourself, is this real? And if it is, then yeah, and it's but to some people it might not be in those senses. And
but that's the number one question at all sites. If you just follow people around and the site looks over restored, the first thing the first or second question always is this real? And then that becomes, and if you say, well, no, it's a replica, then all of a sudden the site loses its connection with that member of the community. But if you can say, yeah, this is real, this is the space where this happened or that happened, then all of a sudden people do pay attention. It's like one of the trades we don't talk about often, but it is, and they don't like to consider themselves as trade, are the curators who furnish the buildings. Well, curators often do research, but sometimes they don't. It's based on what they believe the past should have been, not what the past was. The example I use is the bed in a Riel house. Big question, did Riel sleep in a bed? Did his mother sleep in a bed? Or did she sleep in a hammock? Well, that is culturally a very, very important question, because how you arrange the furniture in a house. Well, everyone said, well, given their class, of course they slept in a bed. And I said, are you sure? Where's your evidence? Well, there is no evidence. Saying, well, here are all these period photographs and period sketches done by an Ontario newspaper in the 1860s, which show that most Métis houses have hammocks. So how are you going to furnish this? How are you going to do something knowledgeable that preserves and cherishes a culture. And that is always a conundrum on some trades. So I believe everything should be research-based, should be carefully documented, whether it's photographs, oral history, whatever, but you've got to be really, really, really careful not to make assumptions. And one of the assumptions under a lot of questioning today in interviews is, for example, dealing with trades, let's say the building trades. I would love to have chats with indigenous tradesmen who were involved in the construction of the residential schools, of homes on the reserves, or whether they were not involved in those projects. Because I do know that a lot of them were hired as tradespeople, but were not, in that period of the 1880s and 90s, not necessarily certified as tradesmen, because it just didn't happen in Canada then. So when does a community lose its status and lose its ability to build its own homes and houses? And how does that change over time? I would say I would make the same argument with Ukrainian folk houses. Is when were those skills lost? Who now has those skills? And can those skills be engineered into a more into today's society, so we don't make assumptions about, quote, that is a traditional skill. Traditional skills are held by people who are no longer relevant today. So you've got to be really careful in using the word traditional Ukrainian folk houses. Oh, well, they're houses that have no relevance to today. Well, that's not true, because actually mud and thatch could be environmentally something really interesting for country folk houses. They certainly still build them in parts of Europe, and they're incredibly energy efficient and ecologically friendly. Or you say, well, that's a traditional indigenous craft. Well, then you say, well, of course, therefore it has no relevance to today because it's traditional. Well, I would argue against that, and I would say you can look at those crafts and skills and decide, what can we learn to move forward and make sure they don't die, so that when we need them and when society wants to learn about them again, that we have that knowledge. And that, to me, is preservation of that knowledge is really, really important. One of the elders at Head Smashed In said to me, you may think, maybe it wasn't to me, but it was said to a group, at least to three of us, I can remember being there. You may think, and maybe we are yesterday's people, he said, but you know, we have wisdom to offer. You may not want that wisdom now, but you may want that wisdom 100 years from now. And he said, the Creator has let us survive so that we can maintain that wisdom, so that when you need us, we'll still be here and our knowledge will still be here. So I look at that bit of wisdom as covering a lot of this knowledge, is that we have a duty to manage that knowledge in a way that will allow subsequent generations and today's generation to use it in a wise and thoughtful, caring manner, whether it's crafts like high tanning, beadwork, whether it's spiritual practices that should be maintained and encouraged to evolve in their own way. But there's lots of things that this project has going for it in the future.
That's fantastic. I just want to ask also, what to you is the most important to pass down to, for you, I'll ask historians, but also for tradespeople, but you can keep it specific to historians as well. But yeah, what would be the number one thing to pass down?
Number one is keep an open mind. Nothing is as it appears to be. That to me is the number one. I was just teaching a course on interpretation, and someone provided a framework for a history of a region. And it was, fur traders came, impacted indigenous people, industry came, and here we are today, aren't we all successful? They're saying, well, that's one way of looking at things, but you could look at things differently. You could look at them through the eyes of how have gender relations changed over time? How has class structure changed over time? What is the relation of the laboring people who built things to their artifacts today? Or how does that change over time? Just keep questioning everything. If you do that, you will move further ahead. For example, you say traditional trades. I always say, why is it traditional? Why are you using that word? It's yesterday's word. It's telling these people that they're not relevant to today. So why are you making and relegating people to a less relevant status? So I always say, ensure that everything you do and continue to do, you question it. And if you do that, then as a historian, whether you're a historian, a tradesperson, whatever, wherever you are, then you will be able to move ahead. But most people don't question. And what can I say? If you don't question, you can't move ahead. You have to understand yourself. You have to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if you can do that, then you can move ahead. Whether you're dealing with planning a heritage site, saying like, why am I doing that? Is this the right approach to planning? Should we do something else? And then what is the ultimate value of changing, let's say, your planning? It's to get a better sense of what community and culture wants and can sustain. And then I say the same with, the law. A lot of people say, well, the law is the law. And I say, no, actually the law is made by humankind. And if humankind made it, they can change it. So if a heritage legislation is inappropriate, we could change it. Well, they say, well, I can't change it. I said, if everyone wants to change it, it can change. It's not a big to-do. It can be done. It's the same with the under legislation. It's a regulatory framework. Most acts have everything's pursuant to regulations. Regulations can be passed general by an order in council or minister. Don't like it? Think about it. What would you like instead? How are you going to achieve it? How are you going to change things? And someone said, well, that's a constantly confrontational approach to everything. I said, not necessarily, but if none of us think and we all accept, nothing ever will change. So what I say to move ahead is keep an open mind, keep questioning, keep changing, and always see yourself as an agent of change, because you can change things.